17th, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, friends and compatriots from both sides of the Johor Causeway. Firstly, a word of thanks to SOAS and to the Monsoons Book Club for organizing this launch of my historical memoir, Living in a Time of Deception. Thank you for your hard work. This book began as a personal memoir, but pretty soon I found this framework rather inadequate. Thankfully, Wong Suk Yi and Lisa Hong came into the picture and helped to fashion this book into a historical memoir dealing with the politics of Singapore in the period 1954 to 1965, where we witnessed, among others, the very important events in our bilateral history of merger in 1963 and the subsequent acrimonious separation from Malaysia in 1965. So, Living in a Time of Deception turned out to be a historical memoir focusing on my role in and my understanding of the politics of that epoch. What we, Singaporeans and Malaysians on either side of the Johor Causeway, are living with today is the fallout of the failed Malaysian merger plan. What is the merger plan? It is a critical turning point in history which has defined both Singapore and Malaysia society and politics up till today. Merger with Malaya was a goal that people in post-war Singapore and Malaya all believed in. It is going back to being one country, a reunification, but this goal has been destroyed. It was destroyed by the manner in which it was carried out. It was a hasty, temporary measure to preserve British strategic interests. Separation came about due to increasing communal tension generated by the Mad Mullahs, as Lee Kuan Yew called the UMNO extremists. Equally, Lee Kuan Yew played the communal line to boost his position in the new federation. However, in PAP's history, separation is seen only as a betrayal by UMNO. Lee was supposedly heartbroken by separation. He cried on TV when announcing separation. He blamed the Federation for the so-called betrayal of the desire for unity of the country. He portrays the birth of an independent Singapore as a reluctant political birth. However, the facts about merger and separation tell quite a different story. Briefly, none of the three powers, Tunku Abdul Rahman, the British, or Lee Kuan Yew, had a concept of national unity. In fact, they were not enthusiastic about merger until the PAP government became very shaky. This was after the Hong Lim and Anson by-elections in the first half of 1961. The PAP lost both and was in danger of being voted out by the next general election to be held before the end of 1963. The electorate was unhappy that the government had failed to honor its election promises of freeing all political detainees and passing legislation to strengthen the trade unions. 2. The Malaysia scheme was the hasty life jacket that the British threw to the Lee government. The terms of merger were never completely disclosed, even to the Legislative Assembly. A bogus referendum was held, where there was no choice to reject merger in 1963. Number 3, merger and Malaysia, therefore, was half-baked as a political project. Key issues like citizenship, political rights for Singapore were glossed over. Let me elaborate further. In 1961, after Lord Selkirk became the UK High Commissioner for Singapore and Commissioner General for Southeast Asia, he assiduously pushed for merger, the cardinal aim of which was to safeguard the efficiency of the British military base in Singapore. At this juncture, I must ask my audience to forgive me for paraphrasing sentences and literally lifting out terminologies and phrases from the correspondence between Lord Selkirk and the Colonial Office, as found in the British archives, to paint the picture then. Lord Selkirk took the Malaysia merger plan, first mooted in the aftermath of the Second World War, from the cupboard, dusted it, and offered it to Lee Kuan Yew as a lifeline during the Hong Lim by-elections in 1961. It was obvious to the British then that Lee Kuan Yew was no longer the political force that he was in 1959, when he swept the electoral victory on the back of left-wing support. As predicted by Selkirk, the PAP and Lee Kuan Yew lost Hong Lim by-elections to what the British described as a sea of hostile local population, necessitating the British to throw out a lifeline to Lee Kuan Yew, and by extension, a lifeline to ensure the security of the British military base in Singapore. Thus, Lord Selkirk's main aim in giving an old Malaysian merger plan a serious and renewed interest was to safeguard the efficiency of the British military base in a sea of hostile local population that had overwhelmingly rejected the PAP and Lee Kuan Yew in 1961 Hong Lim by-election. It was British policy at that time to intervene in the foreign affairs of countries in Asia. For such a policy to be executed, an efficient military base was imperative. If we go back to 1946, after the Second World War, the British had sent troops to Saigon to fight the Vietnamese nationalist movement, as well as to Surabaya to fight Sukarno's nationalist forces. Because of this policy, the British decided to separate Singapore from mainland Malaya with the McMichael Treaty. The Straits settlements of Malacca and Penang could be incorporated into the Malayan Union, but the British must retain control of the Straits settlement of Singapore, which contained the military base that would provide backup for its policy of intervention. The people of Singapore and Malaya, headed by Putra AMCJA, a unity of Malay and non-Malay organizations promoted by the MDU, the Malayan Democratic Union, opposed the separation of Singapore from Malaya. The People's Constitution, written by MDU members John Eber and Billy Kwok, had called for the unity of the Straits settlement of Singapore, just like Penang and Malacca with the mainland. The People's Constitution envisaged dominion status for Malaya following the Canadian model. Most strikingly, the People's Constitution proposed, with agreement from all factions, a citizenship called Malayu citizenship. It explained that it is a non-colonial term for Malayan citizenship. Tan Cheng Lock, one of the leaders, agreed with this definition for our citizenship, and we were to have Malay Malayu, Chinese Malayu, Indian Malayu, and so forth. However, the British governor refused to accept the petition embodying the People's Constitution, and so Tan Cheng Lock had to call for a one-day hartal, which was a general strike of all people in the country, mainland and Malaya and Singapore. He had learned this Hindustani word when he was in India during the Second World War. The hartal, the first nationwide joint Malay and non-Malay political action, was successful. All economic activities in mainland Malaya and Singapore shut down on October the 20th, 1947. The British ignored this peaceful show of strength from the people and went ahead to separate Singapore from Malaya, for the sole reason of maintaining effective control of the military base in Singapore to further British policy of intervention in the sovereign affairs of neighboring countries in the region. After the Second World War, the British Empire was economically broke. It ran down its military bases around the world, but it was determined to hold on to Singapore because of the growth and strength of the nationalist movements in Asia. The British revealed that one of UK's strategic aims in the Far East was, and I quote, to maintain an independent contribution to the nuclear deterrent against China. It was also necessary for the British to obtain some semblance of recognition from the United States that the weakened British still could play a supportive role in this region to advance the interests of the United States globally. By 1960, tactical nuclear weapons were stored in Singapore, in the Singapore base, and heavy bombers capable of carrying them were stationed in Singapore and ready to fly out to China in case of disputes with the latter. This British nuclear deterrent was independent of the United States nuclear deterrent against China, and disputes with mainland China could not be ruled out. For example, in 1949, Sir Winston Churchill, ignorant of geography, thought the Yangtze River was the Thames, where the British Royal Navy could fly up and down with impunity. When the British Royal Navy was stopped from flying up and down what it thought was the Thames, Sir Winston Churchill threatened to bomb the Chinese Liberation Army. The base was also important to execute British policy of putting Sukarno's feet to the fire. One could not put Sukarno's feet to the fire without the muscles provided by the Singapore military base. Ever since then, the British had been interfering in the affairs of Indonesia, resulting in confrontation with Malaysia and the Gestapo or G30S in 1965. Sukarno did not last out his year of living dangerously. Against this background, we, referred to as the sea of hostile local population, were arrested in February the 2nd, 1963 under Operation Coldstore. The main reason for it was to preserve the effectiveness of the British military base in Singapore. There is documentation in the archive that shows that Tunku Abdul Rahman had wanted our arrest as a precondition for merger with Singapore. There is no doubt on that. Likewise, I have no doubt that Lee Kuan Yew desired our arrest at that juncture in history. Each has his own reason for our arrest, but it was the British who called the shot, as it was imperative upon them to drain away that sea of local hostility against their base in Singapore. Of the three conspirators in this scheme, it was Lee Kuan Yew who stood most to lose should he not find a role within Malaysia. He stated quite clearly to Philip Moore, the UK Deputy High Commissioner to Singapore, that if he has no place in Malaysia, then the chance of Malaysia succeeding would be nil. In this new scenario, where the left-wing opponents have been decimated with the help of the British and the Tunku, Lee Kuan Yew now aspired to replace the MCA, Malayan Chinese Association, as UMNO's partner in the alliance. Lee Kuan Yew was fully aware of and completely accept UMNO's communal or racial policy. But when the Tunku refused to accommodate him, he then turned around and contested the general elections in 1964 against the MCA, with the aim of showing to the Tunku that the PAP, not the MCA, had the support of the Chinese in mainland Malaya. Lee Kuan Yew reneged on his promise to the Tunku that he would not raise the communal tension in Malaya by contesting the general election in 1964. In the 1964 general election, the PAP put up 5 candidates, but only one won. Lee Kuan Yew's political horizon in Malaysia was dim indeed. The archive quotes Lord Selkirk as predicting that Lee Kuan Yew would now switch to adopt a chauvinistic line. That was precisely what he did. He convened the Malaysian Socialist Solidarity Conference. He said that learning Malay as a national language was a way back to the jungle. As expected, Malay radicals retaliated. Communal tension was raised, which resulted in racial riots in Singapore. Faced with that situation, the Tunku decided to talk to Lee on ways to solve the problem, but there was no talk of separation at that time. However, 2 intervening events took place to obliterate the need for a British military base in Singapore. The first concerned the Chinese, who on October the 16th, 1964, had exploded their first atomic bomb, and with it, a cardinal aim of the British military base in Singapore which was to blackmail China, evaporated into smoke. The second event deals with Sukarno, who by June 1965 was in a very precarious position. Early that year, Sukarno had alluded to the year of living dangerously, for he knew and expected that foreign powers were on the verge of toppling him. He did not last 1965. By June, July, the British who were involved in the Gestapo operations were aware of Sukarno's impending downfall and therefore allowed Singapore and Malaysia to negotiate a separation. The Albatross file indicated that Lee Kuan Yew was in favor of separation. These 2 intervening events made the aims of retaining a British military base in Singapore unnecessary, and so the separation of Singapore from Malaysia was announced in August the 9th, 1965, with Lee Kuan Yew shedding tears on television. Today, we are living in the fallout of this failed Malaysia merger scheme. The British had ordered our mass arrests in order to maintain the Singapore military base in 1963 and abdicated their responsibility to free us when Singapore base was no longer useful. Today, they present themselves as advocates of democracy and human rights, but were silent on their past role in Malaya and Singapore. They arrested us under Operation Coldstore and failed to release us when they handed Singapore over to Malaysia via the merger plan. Hence, the British must share the odium of our continued detention without trial over many long years in the inhuman treatment of solitary confinement for months and in the subsequent waves upon waves of arrests that followed. Today, the relations between Malaysia and Singapore are not friendly. Singapore is known to have interfered in the affairs of Malaysia to enhance its own economic position. An example of such interference occurred during Tunku Razali's fight against Dr. Mahathir for the leadership of UMNO. Today, the communal tension within the country in both Malaysia and Singapore is heightened compared to the days when I was a student. Very unfortunately, in the process of Malaysia merger and separation, Lee Kuan Yew and the PEP had played the communal card to the hilt, whipping up both Malay and Chinese chauvinism with the Malaysian Solidarity Conference and the Malaysia slogan. The British, having achieved their aim in the region and finding their base no longer necessary and costly to maintain, had long packed up and gone, leaving us with this fallout today as we stare at each other divided by the Johor Causeway. Thank you.